Night had fallen slowly, like a curtain drawn by a tired hand, and the forest received it the way an old friend accepts a familiar coat, without surprise, without haste. The last threads of sunset had long since sunk behind the line of distant hills, and now the trees stood together in patient silence, their trunks dark pillars, their branches a tangled script against a heavy sky. The road that wound toward the village was little more than a suggestion of a path, a pale thread among the shadows, and on that thread walked a woman in a red cloak. She was not a girl now. She had grown into the length of her limbs, into the gravity of her gaze. The villagers still called her Red when they spoke of her, though her given name was something else, something less sharp, less storied. Red, they said, the way people spoke of a tale they half believed and half wanted to forget. The girl who had once gone into the woods and returned changed. Her cloak was not as bright as it had been when it was new. Time and weather had deepened the red, turned it into something richer, like wine or old velvet. The edges were frayed in places, the hem darkened with earth and years. Still, she drew it close around her now, more out of habit than cold, as the night air folded in. Her boots made a soft sound on the packed dirt and scattered leaves, a rhythm that seemed too small for the vastness of the forest around her. Above, a patchwork of clouds and stars drifted between the branches. Somewhere, unseen, an owl called once, then again, then fell silent, deciding the conversation did not interest it tonight. She walked alone, but not unaccompanied. The forest itself had a presence that pressed close but not unkindly, a weight of old stories, old watching, old agreements made between human and wild. She could feel it in the way the path held steady beneath her feet, and the way the wind did not leap out to startle her, but moved with slow, deliberate hands through the leaves. If she listened carefully, she could hear her own thoughts. They came not in sharp, anxious bursts as they had in the city, with its iron schedules and crowded rooms, but in long, unhurried strands. She had left that life behind for now, the noise and the light and the constant obligation to perform a version of herself that made other people comfortable. She had come back here, to the village, to the forest that had once almost swallowed her, and then unexpectedly saved her. She had not intended to arrive so late, but the coach had been delayed, and one choice led to another, and in the end it was either walk now or wait in a cold inn between strangers and a ticking clock. She had chosen the forest without thinking too hard about it. The decision had settled over her like an accepted truth. She trusted the trees more than she trusted timetables. She drew in a slow breath, tasting damp earth and old bark, and the faint scent of something green, even this late in the season. There was another note beneath it, almost memory more than smell. Smoke from her grandmother's fire, the ghost of herbs drying in the rafters, the rough wool of blankets that had once enveloped a frightened child. Her grandmother was gone now. The cottage still stood, but it belonged to the village in a way, a place people spoke of with a mixture of fondness and caution. Red had inherited the key and the contents of the home. Jars of dried plants labeled in fading ink, a few worn books, a wooden box with a metal latch that did not open no matter how politely you asked it to. And, of course, she had inherited the story. The story had never really left her. She walked, and with each step she could feel the years folding in on themselves. The forest was both smaller and larger than it had been when she was a child. Smaller because she could now see how the path was clear, and the danger, in many places, exaggerated. Larger because she could sense how much of it still lay unseen, layered behind what was visible, like ink beneath ink. Her breath moved in and out, a steady tide in her chest. She let it slow. There was no hurry now. The village lights were still distant, a faint, honey-colored suggestion between the trunks, and the night had more to give her before she arrived. A soft wind slipped through the branches, and for a moment it seemed to speak in the rustling language she had never quite forgotten. Leaves brushed against each other, dry and conversational. A twig gave underfoot with a tiny crack, a punctuation mark in the quiet. She listened not just with her ears, but with the deep, animal part of her body that remembered the forest as it had been when she came here first, in fear and innocence and something like stubborn hope. That first time the fear had been sharp and raw, the danger more obvious, the path more treacherous. There had been the wolf, and the trust she had not yet learned to extend, and the adults whose stories had turned caution into a cage. Now the fear was different, softer, not about teeth or claws, but about herself, about who she might be, returning here, about whether the forest would remember her, and if it did, what it would decide. She halted for a moment, letting the silence gather around her like deep water. Her eyes adjusted to the low light. She could make out the shapes of trees, the stacked stones marking the edge of the path, the pale stretch of road ahead. She was older now. She had lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there before, carved not by age alone, but by decisions, by late nights, by conversations that required her to be wiser than she felt. There were parts of her that had hardened, and parts that had gone soft in ways that startled her. She had learned the languages of contracts and deadlines, of rent and trains, and the quiet cruelty of people who mistook fatigue for weakness. She had learned how to make her voice calm on the phone when inside it shook. Yet beneath it all, like a deep root, she had kept the memory of this forest, of a night when she had been smaller, and the world had been divided into safe and dangerous, into good and bad, and then something had happened that blurred the line, and she had never fully returned to the old categories. Now her feet knew the path without needing to be told. There was a bend ahead where a large beech tree leaned over the road like a listening elder. Past that, a small stream crossed under the path, invisible to the eye but audible if you were willing to hear. She came to the tree and brushed her fingers along its bark in greeting. It did not answer in words, of course, but some tension in her shoulders loosened as she touched the rough surface, as if the tree had accepted her presence, recognized her in its slow, wooden way. "Still here," she murmured, not sure whether she meant herself or the forest. A shape moved in her peripheral vision, a flicker of deeper shadow among shadows. She froze, hands still resting on the trunk, senses sharpening in that old, primal way. There was a pause, a held breath. Then the shape resolved itself into a deer, pale flank, catching a stray thread of starlight as it stepped carefully between the undergrowth. Its head lifted, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling toward her. They regarded each other quietly, its dark eyes reflecting a pinprick of light. Red exhaled slowly, letting the breath leave without sound. The deer watched her a moment longer, then lowered its head and moved on, stepping across the path, disappearing into the deeper wood. She relaxed, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. The forest was still doing what it had always done, moving around her, regarding her, choosing its distance. She continued walking. The further she went, the more the forest's memory uncurled. The trees here were older, their roots knotted under the earth like buried bones. The air felt thicker, not with menace, but with history. This was where the old stories came from, not the pretty tales told to children, cleaned and trimmed, but the older versions whispered near bonfires and in sick rooms, where people spoke of bargains and thresholds, and the price of ignoring what lived beyond the fence. Since she had come back to the village, she had heard the old stories again. They had shifted over time. Some had been softened, some sharpened. In certain tellings, she had become a cautionary figure. In others, a heroine. In still others, a curiosity. The wolf was sometimes a monster, sometimes a trickster, sometimes a misunderstood guardian of the boundary between worlds. It depended who was speaking and what they needed the story to do. She did not correct them. Stories belonged to those who told them as much as to those who lived them. But at night, when she lay awake staring at the low ceiling of her grandmother's cottage, she found herself revisiting her own memory of that earlier journey, not as legend, but as lived experience. The forest then had seemed endless and sharp-edged. She had felt small and fragile, her red cloak a bright target against all that green. The wolf's gaze had been terrifying in its intensity, his presence a pressure at the edges of her awareness. Yet for all the fear, there had been something else in him too, something she did not have words for as a child. As an adult, she recognized it, an old, weary intelligence, a kind of patience, a familiarity with hunger, not just the hunger of the body, but the hunger of the denied, the banished, the misunderstood. She walked now with those thoughts folded inside her like letters she had not yet decided to send. The path dipped slightly, then rose again. As she crested the gentle incline, she saw it, a break in the darkness ahead, a suggestion of more open space, the crossroads. She slowed. Here, the main path toward the village forked from a narrower one that curved deeper into the trees. A crooked signpost stood at the junction, its arm pointing, its letters faded. It had once read village in a sturdy, sensible script, and beneath it, in smaller, older letters, old road. The lower word had nearly worn away now, eaten by weather. When she was a child, she had not noticed the second path until it was too late. She had followed a stranger's suggestion, then a voice in the undergrowth, then her own resentment, until she had been lost in a story someone else had written for her. Now she stopped, not because she was unsure, but because she recognized the place the way one recognizes a scar. She stood, listening. The forest seemed to have leaned in, her breath condensed in the cool air, small clouds of warmth. Her pulse fluttered, then steadied. "If you're here," she said softly, without looking into the trees, "this would be the place." Her voice did not carry far. It didn't need to. The forest was in the habit of hearing things not meant for human ears. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then there was the sound of movement, a careful, unhurried sound, like something with practice walking quietly. A branch gave a soft groan. Leaves rustled. She did not turn away from the signpost. Instead, she allowed the awareness of that presence to come closer, to arrange itself within the edges of her attention. When the voice came, it was not the growl of nightmare, but a low, roughened tone, textured by age and the wild. It seemed to come from everywhere and one place at once, from the dark between the trees. "You remember the path this time." She felt the hairs at the nape of her neck stir, not with fear but with recognition. "I remember many things," she replied. Her own voice sounded different here, stripped of the polite shapes it had to wear in other places. It sounded honest. "The last time, I took the long way round." A shape disentangled itself from the shadows. He stepped into view slowly. No theatrical leap, no sudden lunge. If anything, he moved like someone stepping into a room where something delicate was sleeping, careful not to wake it too abruptly. The wolf was larger than she remembered, though that may have been the difference between a child's vantage point and an adult's. His fur had silver in it now, streaks along his muzzle and at the ruff of his neck. The darkness of his coat was not uniform. It held shades of charcoal and midnight and the deep brown of wet bark. His eyes, though, were very nearly the same, pale, luminous, with a depth that suggested he had seen more winters than any one creature should be able to count. He regarded her in silence, head slightly tilted, as if comparing her to some earlier picture in his mind. "You have changed," he said finally. "So have you," she answered. His gaze moved briefly over her, boots, cloak, hands, face, and returned to her eyes. "You smell of cities," he said. "Brick and smoke, rooms with no windows that open." A corner of her mouth lifted. "I've been away." "I know," he replied. There was no accusation in his tone, only statement. The forest did not chide a leaf for falling when it must. She turned to face him fully now, standing here, speaking to a creature that most of her former colleagues would never believe existed. She felt a strange, quiet rightness, as if some part of herself that had been held at an angle for years had finally found its proper alignment. "I didn't expect to see you," she said, though another part of her knew that wasn't quite true. Something had drawn her to this path at this hour. Something stubborn and old inside her, the same part that had once refused to accept that all danger came from teeth and claws. "You came to my forest," he said. "You walk at night, alone. Did you think I would not notice?" "Your forest," she echoed, one brow arching. He let the words hang for a moment, then made a sound that might have been a short, dry laugh. "We can debate ownership another night. Tonight you are tired. You walk as someone who has spent many years pretending not to be afraid." Her chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition that slid too near the bone. "I walk as someone going home," she replied, more softly than she intended. The wolf's gaze sharpened, attention narrowing. "Home," he repeated, tasting the word. "To the house of the old woman." "Yes," she hesitated. "It's mine now, on paper at least." "And in truth?" he asked. The question sank into her like a stone into a still pool. In truth. What belonged to her in truth? Her name on a deed did not make the cottage feel any less like a place she was borrowing from a woman whose presence still clung to its corners. "I don't know yet," she admitted. The wolf watched her for a time. "Then perhaps," he said carefully, "you are not simply going home. Perhaps you are also searching for it." She thought of the apartment she had left in the city. The walls thin enough to let in neighbors. Arguments. The window that faced another building's brick. The feeling of returning each night to a space that held her belongings, but not her rest. Her throat tightened. She looked away, blinking at the vague hint of village lights in the distance. "Will you walk with me?" she asked. She felt childish as soon as the words were out. He owed her nothing. He was wild, older than her grandmother's stories, answerable to no human request. But he merely tilted his head again, listening to something she could not hear. Then he stepped forward, out onto the path, his paws silent on the earth. "I will walk for a while," he said, "until the edge of the trees. Beyond that, the village is your territory." She fell into step beside him. Not too close. She knew better than to assume intimacy with a creature who had teeth like his. But not far either. Close enough to feel the shape of him at the edge of her peripheral vision, to sense the space he displaced, the way he moved in and among the shadows as if he wore them. They walked in silence at first. The forest around them seemed to adjust to their passage, its sounds reorganizing. The soft skitter of a small animal changing direction, the faint drip of water from a leaf, the distant creak of a branch. Her mind, which in the city had been filled with constant noise, emails, expectations, the news cycle's relentless churn, was strangely empty now. Into that emptiness something else seeped. Awareness of how her body moved, the weight of her steps, the slow swing of her arms, the air against her face, the smell of damp earth and leaf mold. "Humans have forgotten how to walk, just to walk," the wolf said after a while, as if continuing a conversation begun years ago. "You walk only to arrive or to escape. "You watch us closely," she said. "I have had time." His tone was not unkind. "Once, long ago, your kind walked differently here. They knew which trees could be leaned on, where the wind forgot itself and the air stilled enough to hear a thought all the way through." She tried to imagine that. Villagers who walked without hurry, who knew the forest not as a threat but as a teacher. How many generations ago had that been? How many stories had to be retold, altered, simplified, before caution became fear, and fear became a gate nailed shut? "Some of us still remember," she said quietly. "You remember," he corrected. "That is different from your kind remembering, though it is a beginning." There was no use arguing. She let the words stand. They passed the place where, once, a fallen tree had blocked the path. As a child, she had scrambled over it, bark scratching her palms. The tree was gone now, its trunk long since cleared by human hands, but she felt the echo of it as surely as if her body still carried the bruises. Memory layered itself over the present like translucent cloth. She saw herself small and angry, basket swinging, cloak too bright. She heard again the oil-slick voice of the stranger who had intercepted her on the road that first time, all friendly questions and careful, manufactured concern. "You were smaller than your cloak," the wolf observed, a hint of something like amusement in his voice. "You were larger than my terror," she replied. He made that rough huffing sound again, neither quite laughter nor disdain. "Humans tell that part of the story poorly," he said. "They keep the teeth in the bed, and the older woman swallowed whole, but they leave out the parts that make their throats uncomfortable." She glanced at him. "Which parts?" "The parts where you were angry at being sent through the woods alone," he said. "Where you were already halfway to danger before you ever met me, not because of wolves, but because no one listened when you said you were afraid." Her steps faltered. The path continued, unconcerned. "How would you know that?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "The forest hears the things you do not say out loud," he replied. "I was there. In the branches above you. In the spaces between your footsteps. I knew you before I spoke to you. You were not the only one who was hungry that day." They walked on. There was a weight in her chest now, but it was not the choking pressure of panic. It was something slower, larger. A recognition that the story she had been told about that time, that she had been foolish, naive, reckless, was only one way to arrange the pieces. Another way existed, one in which a child had been asked to carry too much, too soon, through a world adults did not want to admit was dangerous in the ways that truly mattered. "Why didn't you harm me?" she asked, voice almost a whisper. "You could have. You scared me. Everyone still says you are." She couldn't quite say the word. The wolf's ears flicked back for a moment, then forward again. "I am what I am," he said. "I am teeth, and hunger, and instinct. I am also older than your village and the fence they built around their fear. I do not eat children." He paused. "Most days." She gave him a sharp look. His tongue lolled very slightly in what might have been an old, dangerous kind of humor. "I did think about it," he admitted. "You were noisy. Anger is noisy. Loneliness is noisy. They scratch at the edges of the world. The scent of it drew me. But when I saw you buckle under the weight of your own story, I lost my appetite." "I wasn't that dramatic," she muttered. He regarded her sidelong. "You are human. Drama is your native tongue." She almost laughed, then swallowed it. The sound would have echoed too sharply in this quiet. "So what stopped you?" she asked again. It mattered, for reasons she could not name. He fell silent for several steps, head angled slightly as if listening inward. "You looked at me," he said at last. Truly looked, not the way a rabbit looks at a hawk. Pure terror and no room for anything else. You looked and you were afraid, yes. But there was curiosity, a stubbornness. You were told I was only one thing. You did not want that to be true, even if it made you safer to believe it. She absorbed that. And that was enough to keep me from your teeth? No, he said. It was enough to make me wait, to see if anyone would come for you. To see what you would do when the story did not follow the script you had been given. A faint rumble moved through him. You surprised me. She remembered the way she had spoken to him that day, voice shaking, insisting on continuing to her grandmother's cottage, despite his attempt to divert her. He had tried to play the role expected of him. She had refused to fully step into hers. Adults don't like when children surprise them, she said. It means their rules are not as absolute as they like to pretend. Adults do not like when anyone surprises them, he corrected. It reminds them that the world existed before they arrived and will continue after they are gone. They are very invested in believing their fear can control more than it does. They walked a while in silence. The path began to descend in a gentle slope. She knew that below, somewhere beyond the trees, ran a stream, and beyond that the land would rise again toward the village, the houses nesting close together around their shared stories. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you like surprises?" He considered. "I like the kind that grows slowly, seeds, seasons, the way a fallen tree becomes a home for 1,000 small lives. The way a human who once trembled at every crack of twig returns to the woods with her shoulders less tight." She exhaled, a breath that might have been a laugh if it hadn't caught on something softer. "I still tremble," she admitted. "I did not say you had stopped." His tone was matter-of-fact, neither scolding nor consoling. "You simply tremble differently. It no longer rules your feet." They continued down the slope, listening to the murmur of the unseen stream grow louder. The forest around them seemed to lean in closer, branches arching overhead like a chapel's ribs. "You said humans used to walk differently here," she said. "How did they walk?" "As if they belonged," he said simply. "Not as visitors, not as intruders, as part of the same fabric. They knew when to take and when to leave, when to cut and when to let grow. They brought their dead to the edge of the woods and spoke to them as if someone was listening." He glanced at her. They were often foolish, often cruel, but they remembered that they were not alone, even when they wished they were. "And then?" she prompted. "Then someone decided that what lived in the forest was only threat, never teacher," he said. "Fence followed fence, story followed fence. It was tidier that way. Children could be told, 'Do not go into the woods. There are wolves there,' rather than, 'Do not go into the woods alone, bearing all your unspoken questions, because something might answer.'" The stream appeared between the trees, its surface catching a smear of starlight. They crossed it by a narrow wooden bridge, the planks creaking softly under their combined weight. On the far side, the trees thinned a little. She could see, through the trunks, the faint suggestion of the village now, a cluster of darker shapes against the horizon, some with the warm eyes of lit windows. Smoke climbed in thin columns from chimneys, smudging the night. She felt something twist in her gut, not quite dread, not quite relief. Returning here meant more than inheriting a house. It meant stepping back into a story that had been paused but never finished. "You left a place of stone and glass," the wolf said quietly, following her gaze, "for a place of wood and memory." "I left a place that took more than it gave," she replied. "And you think this place will be different?" "I don't know." She shook her head. "But out there, I could never hear myself think. Here, at least, I can listen." "To the trees?" he asked. "To myself," she said. He accepted that with a small dip of his head. They walked until the last of the trees stood around them like a loose ring of sentries. Beyond was the thinning edge of the forest, where wild growth gave way to fields and fences and the first stray chickens that had wandered too far from their coops and decided they liked it that way. The wolf stopped. "Here," he said. "This is as far as I go." She halted beside him. For a moment they both stood looking out toward the village. The air smelled different here. Not as damp, not as deep. It carried hints of smoke and hay and cooking, and the faint, sour tang of old fear. "Will you still be here?" she asked. It felt like an odd question to put to a creature made of forest and story, but it slipped out anyway. He turned his head to look at her fully. "I am always here," he said. "I am in the places you avoid and the ones you are drawn to without knowing why. I am in the unease you feel when you ignore your own hunger too long. Whether you notice me or not is your part of the bargain." She nodded slowly. It was more answer than she had expected, and less than she wanted, which seemed appropriate for the wild. "Thank you," she said, surprising herself, "for walking with me." His gaze lingered on her. "It has been some time since I kept company with a human who listened," he replied. "You may pass through my forest again, preferably on purpose." A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "I'll try." He stepped away from the edge of the path, blending with the shadows as if he had never left them. For a heartbeat his eyes glinted, catching some stray light. Then they dimmed, and he was gone, leaving only the impression of something large and unseen moving through the deeper dark. She stood alone at the forest's edge, ahead, the village, behind, the trees. Beneath her feet, the earth that held both. She took a breath, feeling the cool air slide into her lungs, and started walking again. The village streets were quieter than the city she had left, but they had their own kind of noise. The muffled clink of crockery from behind curtains, the murmur of voices through walls, a dog's bark cut short by a human's admonishing word. Her boots sounded different here, the ground more compacted, the echoes closer. A few people saw her as she passed. Some nodded, some stared. One older man, leaning in the doorway of a tavern, lifted two fingers in something between greeting and acknowledgement. "You're back then," he said. "For a while," she replied. He grunted, not unfriendly. "Your grandmother's place is still standing." "So I heard," she answered. "You'll find ghosts there," he warned, perhaps out of habit. "I've brought a few of my own," she said, and moved on before he could reply. The cottage stood where it always had, at the far end of the lane, pressed against the shoulder of the forest. Its thatched roof was newer than the one she remembered. At some point, the villagers had replaced it, unwilling to let the place collapse, though none of them wanted to live in it full time. The walls were whitewashed, the windows small and crooked. Smoke curled from the chimney, a faint surprise. Someone had lit a fire ahead of her. She paused at the gate, hand resting on the rough wood. The garden beyond was half tamed, half wild. Herbs her grandmother had once tended had gone to seed. New things had grown in their place. Volunteer nettles, a scattering of foxglove, a stubborn rosebush with a few late blooms clinging to its branches like small, fragrant memories. She opened the gate, walked up the path, and lifted the latch of the front door. Warmth greeted her, along with a familiar smell: dried plants, wood smoke, old paper. The fire in the hearth had been banked, its light low and steady. On the small table near the window sat a mug and a teapot, steam faintly curling from its spout. "For you," a voice said from the corner. She started, then relaxed as she recognized the tall, spare figure of the village midwife and healer, a woman who had once been her grandmother's apprentice and, later, her colleague. "I thought you might want something hot when you arrived," the woman said, standing from the chair where she'd been waiting. Her hair was streaked with gray now, her hands still stained with the work of her trade. The coach was late. "Word travels fast," Red said, shrugging off her cloak. "In a village, it has nowhere else to go," the woman replied. She came forward and embraced Red briefly, arms strong. "I'm glad you came back." Red let herself lean into the hug for a heartbeat, longer than she might have allowed in the city. Then she stepped back. "I wasn't sure I'd stay," she admitted. "You don't have to decide tonight." The woman poured tea into the mug, handed it to her. "Sleep first, think later. You've always done better that way." Red wrapped her hands around the mug, feeling the heat seep into her fingers. She looked around the cottage. So much of it was exactly as she remembered. The shelves with their neat rows of jars, the worn rug before the hearth, the narrow bed against the wall. And yet everything was different, because the woman who had been the heart of this place was gone, and in her stead stood absence, thick and quiet. "I saw him," Red said, before she could talk herself out of it. The midwife glanced at her, a knowing look in her eyes. "The wolf?" "Yes." "Did he speak?" "He always does," Red replied. "Then he thinks you're worth the breath," the woman said simply. "Be careful, but don't be ungrateful." Red drank her tea. It was strong and bitter, laced with something that eased the tightness in her chest. The stories they tell about him. "Stories are tools," the midwife said. "Like knives, they can cut food or cut flesh. Depends who's holding them and why." "Do you believe them?" Red asked. The woman considered. "I believe he is dangerous," she said, "but not in the simple way people like to fear. He is dangerous to certainty, to laziness, to the kind of safety that rots the soul." A faint smile touched her lips. "Much like you." Red huffed softly. "I'm not dangerous." "Not with your hands," the woman agreed. "With your questions." Red finished the tea. Fatigue spread through her now, heavy and insistent. The journey, the forest, the conversation with the wolf, the return to this room. Her body had held it all upright, and now it wanted to lay it down. "We can talk about the rest tomorrow," the midwife said, as if reading her thoughts. "About the work to be done, and whether you want to pick up what she left. For now, sleep. Let the walls remember you. They've missed having a heartbeat inside them." After the woman left, Red banked the fire a little higher, washed the cup, and set it to dry. She ran her fingers along the edge of the table, touched the back of the chair her grandmother had favored, let her hand rest on the doorframe as she moved from room to room. When she finally lay down on the narrow bed, the mattress felt both too firm and exactly right. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the cottage settle around her, the creak of cooling wood, the faint sigh of wind through a gap in the window frame, the small, secret scurry of a mouse in the wall. Her thoughts circled like slow birds. They brushed against memories of the city, the endless light, the hum of electricity, the smell of exhaust and coffee and too many perfumes, and then drifted back to the forest, to the wolf's eyes in the dark, to the way her body had relaxed as soon as the trees closed around her. "You tremble differently now," he had said. She closed her eyes. The forest came with her into sleep. Not as nightmare, but as something else. A vast, breathing presence at the edge of her dreams, watching, waiting, its patience older than any story. In the morning, the village woke with a kind of rough grace. Roosters announced themselves with more enthusiasm than skill. Doors opened. Smoke rose. People stepped out into the woven light of early day and took stock of the weather, the sky, the state of their own thoughts. Red rose too, dressing in clothes that smelled faintly of lavender her grandmother had hung in the chest. She stepped outside and stood for a long moment on the doorstep, letting the chill of dawn seep into her skin. The forest loomed behind the cottage, a dark sea of trunks and branches. Looking at it, she felt the same complex mix of things she always had: curiosity, respect, and a pull she could never entirely explain to anyone who only knew fields and streets. The days that followed did not rush. They unraveled themselves in long, meandering threads. She cleaned the cottage, opening jars whose contents had fused into new, unnameable substances, washing shelves, beating rugs. She walked through the village, letting people see her, letting herself see them, not as figures in the periphery of some childhood story, but as whole, flawed, weary, trying humans. She listened to the midwife talk about the work her grandmother had done, how she had sat at bedsides until dawn, how she had argued with doctors who thought they knew better, how she had carved small spaces of mercy into a world that, more often than not, preferred efficiency. People think of magic as spells and charms, the midwife said, kneeling in the garden to pull up a stubborn weed, but most of it is just attention. Knowing which plant to pick on which morning, noticing when someone's eyes are too bright or too dull, knowing when to speak and when to shut up. Red laughed. My grandmother excelled at the latter. Only with fools, the woman replied. With everyone else she was dangerously patient. Red found her hands learning again the feel of soil, the names of plants. She had been away too long to remember every root and leaf, but the knowledge was still there beneath the surface, like seeds waiting for rain. At night, when the village settled down and the cottage grew quiet, she would stand at the back door and look toward the forest. Sometimes she could swear she felt eyes on her. Not threatening, just there. She did not always see the wolf. He did not appear on command. But the sense of him, of the wild watching the domestic, of the old watching the temporary, remained. One evening, after a day spent grinding herbs and listening to a woman sob about a husband who would not come home from the tavern, Red felt the walls pressing in. She banked the fire, wrapped her cloak around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The village was muffled by night. Few lights burned in windows now. The tavern's lantern threw a warm pool onto the street, within which shadows moved and voices occasionally flared before being shushed. She passed it without stopping. At the edge of the village she paused only briefly before stepping into the forest. The path received her feet as if it had been waiting. The air inside the trees was cooler, fresher. Sounds were different here. She could hear the small noises of nocturnal life, the rustle of a creature in the undergrowth, the soft wing beat of an owl hunting, the distant crack of a branch under the weight of something heavy. She did not walk as far as before, only to the place where the path curved around the beech tree, where the stream's murmur began to thread into hearing. There she sat on a flat stone and simply breathed. "Is it so bad, then?" The wolf's voice came, after she had been quiet some time. She did not start this time. "You're going to have to be more specific," she replied. "Your village," he said. "Your people, your life in their midst." She considered. "It's complicated." "Everything worth doing is," he said. "Otherwise, you would have done it already." She let her shoulders drop, the tension easing without her conscious will. "Sometimes I think it would be easier just to stay out here," she admitted, "in the trees, away from their expectations, their stories." "And live on what?" he asked. "Moss and metaphor?" She almost smiled. "You underestimate my talent for self-sabotage." He stepped into view, fur almost black in the dim light. "You could try," he said, "to abandon them, to become some wild creature in their legends. The witch in the woods, the woman in the red cloak who never comes to market." His eyes did not leave her face. "I wonder how long it would take before you missed the weight of a hand on your shoulder, the sound of a voice speaking your name without fear." She looked down at her own hands, at the faint stains of herb and earth on her fingertips. "They want me to become her," she said. "My grandmother, to fill a shape she left behind, but I am not her." "No," he agreed, "you are you, which is less tidy and more dangerous." She sighed. "You always make it sound so inevitable." "It is not inevitable," he said quietly. "It is simply the path you are already on. You can step off if you choose. Humans do it all the time. They turn away from themselves and call it maturity." She thought of the years in the city, of the ways she had learned to contort herself to fit into spaces that were never built for her shape. She had called it survival. She had called it progress. Some nights, lying in a bed that creaked when she turned over, staring at a dark ceiling too close above her, she had called it a mistake. "Do you ever wish you could be something else?" she asked abruptly. "A rabbit?" he asked dryly. "A cloud? I don't know, less feared, less bound to your role in the stories." He was quiet for a time. When he spoke, his voice had changed. A faint thread of something like weariness running through it. "There were times, long ago," he said, "when I tried to be what they wanted me to be. When I growled and snapped and chased them from the edges of the forest, because that was the game they came here expecting to play. They ran, and then told stories of the terrible wolves. And they kept coming." He shrugged, a ripple moving through his shoulders. "It did not matter what I did. I was their fear-given fur. If I lay down and slept, they dreamed me hunting. If I howled to call my kin, they heard it as a threat. Eventually I realized that their stories belonged to them. My task was to remain myself, regardless." "And what is yourself?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes pale and steady. "I am the part of the world that will not be tamed," he said. "I am the question that stalks your certainties. I am the risk in your comfort and the comfort in your risk. I am the reminder that you cannot build a fence against hunger, only against its expression." She considered that. "That sounds lonely." "Sometimes it is," he said. "But I have the trees, the seasons. The slow, honest company of things that grow and decay without pretending otherwise." He regarded her. "You could have that too. But you came back to them, to your kind. So perhaps, despite everything, you still believe they are worth the trouble." Her throat tightened. "Some of them," she said. He nodded. "That is enough. The forest does not ask you to love every tree, only to respect the fact that the ones you do not notice still hold up the sky." She sat with that, letting it sink into the spaces in her that still ached from trying to hold everything alone. "Will you help me?" she asked quietly. "With what's coming, with what I have to become if I stay?" The wolf tilted his head. "What do you think is coming?" She rubbed her thumb against her forefinger, feeling the ghost of rough bark. "They will come," she said. "The villagers, not all at once. A sick child here, an old man there. Someone who wakes in the night convinced they are dying, when really they are only afraid. They will bring their hurts and their questions. They will want me to fix what can't be fixed, and to reassure them about what should not be reassured." "And you think I can help you with that?" he asked, almost amused. "You are very good at not letting fear dictate your choices," she said. "I could use some of that." He huffed. "I am fear, remember, in their stories." "In their stories," she agreed, "but not in mine." He was quiet. The forest around them breathed. An owl called, low and distant. "I can walk with you," he said finally, "sometimes. When you need to remember that the wild within you is not your enemy, I can remind you to listen more than you speak. And I can frighten away the fools who come to your door seeking spectacle instead of healing." She smiled, a slow, genuine curve of lips. "That last part sounds useful." "Be careful what you promise your people," he added. "Humans are quick to confuse comfort with cure. They will want you to lie to them in gentle words. To say, 'It will be all right,' when you know no such thing." "I won't lie," she said. "You will be tempted," he replied. When faced with a mother who has already lost 2 children and fears a third. When an old man does not want to die. When a young one does not know how to live, you will be tempted to soften truth until it breaks under the weight of their need. She swallowed. Her hands felt suddenly too empty. "What should I say, then?" she whispered. "Say, 'I will stay,'" the wolf said. "Say, 'I will be here while this hurts.' Say, 'I do not know how this ends, but you will not face it alone.' That is more honest than promises you cannot keep, and more powerful, though it feels like less." She let her head drop forward, closing her eyes. Tears prickled, unexpected and hot. She did not brush them away immediately. The night was dark enough to hold them without witnesses. "Stay, then," she said, voice rough, "for a while." "I am here," the wolf replied simply. Time moved strangely there on the stone by the beech tree. Minutes became something else, wide and still. Her breathing slowed. The tension in her chest unknotted, not entirely, but enough to let air through without catching. When she finally rose to go back to the cottage, the wolf rose too. They walked together along the path for a while, until the forest began to thin. At the edge of the trees, he stopped again. "Remember," he said, "you are not only the girl in the red cloak in their stories. You are the woman who walked into the dark and listened." "And you," she said, "are not only the beast in their warnings. You are the one who waited." He bared his teeth, not in threat, but in something that might almost have been a smile. "Go home," he said. She did. The months that followed were both difficult and strangely gentle. She learned again the rhythm of village life, the planting and the harvesting, the feasts and the funerals. People came to her door as she had known they would, some hesitant, some demanding, all of them carrying burdens that were not always obvious at first glance. She sat with them at the table, or at their bedsides, or on the bench outside when the air was better than the 4 walls. She listened to the things they said aloud and the things they didn't. She gave them teas and tinctures, poultices and powders. But more than that, she gave them time. Attention. The kind of presence that her grandmother had wielded like a quiet, inexhaustible magic. Sometimes the wolf watched from the edge of the trees when someone particularly stubborn or particularly frightened came up the path. Red could feel him there, even when she could not see him, his steady gaze a weight between her shoulder blades that somehow kept her grounded. On nights when sleep would not come, when the stories she had heard that day clung to her and would not loosen their grip, she would walk into the forest and sit with him again. They did not always speak. Sometimes they simply shared the dark, listening to the wind move through the branches, letting their separate silences lean against each other like 2 tired figures on the same bench. He told her, on one of those nights of the time before the village, when this place had been only forest and sky and water. He spoke of ancient hunters who moved with respect, of fires that burned in clearings where people danced not to forget their fear, but to acknowledge it and move through it. He spoke of storms that had torn down trees older than any story. and of how the forest had grown again around their fallen trunks, making use of the space they left. "Everything falls," he said. "Everything rises. The question is what you do between." "And what do you suggest?" she asked. "Breathe," he said. "Notice. Protect what you can protect. Let go of what you cannot. Try not to confuse the two." She thought of the woman whose child they had not been able to save, how she had held her as she rocked and sobbed, how the grief had been a physical force in the room, pressing against the walls. "There are some things I cannot hold," she said. "They break me." "They bend you," he corrected. "If you were truly broken, you would not be here asking me the question." She turned her face toward the sky. The stars were faint tonight, blurred by a veil of cloud. "You have a very high tolerance for my being dramatic." "It is one of your more honest traits," he replied. Over time, the villagers' stories about her shifted too. The girl in the red cloak became the woman in the red cloak. The foolish child who had nearly been eaten became the healer who walked into the forest at night and came back with a steadiness that made even the most stubborn men pause before raising their voices. Some said she had made a pact with the wolf. Some said she was half witch, half wild. Some said she was simply lonely and preferred trees to people. She let them say what they liked. She knew that stories would always be written, with or without her consent. Better to live her life than try to edit every telling. She grew older. Not old, not yet, but older than the girl she had been, older than the young woman who had fled the city. Lines deepened around her eyes. Her hands grew calloused in new ways, not from typing or catching trains, but from grinding herbs, from carrying logs, from holding other people's hands. The wolf grew older too, the silver in his fur spread, the stiffness in his joints more evident when he rose. But his eyes remained sharp, bright, with a kind of ageless intelligence. "Do you ever tire?" she asked him once, when she found him lying by the stream, head resting on his paws. "Constantly," he said, "just not of you." She felt warmth flood her chest. "That's oddly kind." "Do not become sentimental," he warned. "I still enjoy frightening those who deserve it." "Define deserve," she challenged. "Those who hit what is weaker than themselves," he said. "Those who cage what was never meant to live behind bars. Those who come into the forest wanting to prove they are not afraid, and in doing so endanger everything around them." She thought of the hunters who sometimes came, boasting of their courage and their guns, how the forest seemed to bristle under their boots, how, more often than not, they left with less bravado than they had brought. "You scare them, then?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes I simply let them feel how small they are. It is amazing what that awareness can do to a man who has built his identity on being large." She laughed softly. "You're very good at that." "It is a speciality," he agreed. As the years slipped by, a strange kind of equilibrium settled over the place. The village went on living in its human way. Births, deaths, feuds, reconciliations, harvests, lean years, small celebrations. The forest went on living in its wild way. Storms, growth, decay, the constant slow rearranging of root and branch. And in the space between those two, Red walked, back and forth, in and out. She put one foot in front of the other, over and over, trusting that the path would appear under her feet, even when she could not see more than a few steps ahead. On a night when the air was cold enough to make her breath puff white, she stood again at the edge of the trees, cloak wrapped tight, looking back toward the village. Most of the windows were dark now. A few still glowed, little islands of warmth in the greater dark. "You have done well," the wolf said from beside her. She turned her head. "At what?" "Staying," he said simply, "and not staying in the same shape." She let that sink in, staying in the same shape. How many times, in the city, had she felt herself hardening into a single, brittle identity? Here she had bent and bent again, finding new ways to hold herself, new ways to let go. "You've done well too," she said, she searched for the word, "at continuing." He snorted softly. "I exist," he said. "It is hardly an accomplishment." "It is, sometimes," she replied. They stood together, watching the night. After a while she said, "Do you regret not eating me all those years ago?" He looked at her, eyes bright. "Sometimes," he said, "on particularly dull afternoons." She smiled, letting the answer be what it was, a tease, a truth, both. "I'm glad you didn't," she said. "I am too," he admitted. "You tell better stories alive." She laughed then, a quiet, warm sound that rose like breath into the cold air. "Walk me home?" she asked. "Always," he said. They moved together along the path, woman and wolf, red cloak and dark fur, at the edge of two worlds that often pretended to be separate, but in truth were only two sides of the same wild, breathing thing. The forest watched them go, its branches a dark web against the sky. The village waited ahead, with its lights and its needs and its small, persistent attempts at kindness. Between them she walked, carrying in her the memory of both. When she reached her door, she turned once more, looking back through the dimness. She could no longer see the wolf, but she felt him there, felt the forest, felt herself in a way she had not, for a long time, in the city's glittering, suffocating light. She went inside, set the kettle on, banked the fire. The cottage breathed around her, its old wood remembering the weight of her grandmother's life, now learning the different rhythm of hers. In bed, beneath the familiar quilts, she closed her eyes and did not have to force her breath to slow. It did so of its own accord, trusting, at last, that it was allowed to rest. Outside, the forest shifted and settled. The wolf lay down under a fringe of roots, his body a long, dark line against the earth. He listened to the night, to the wind, to the small creatures moving, to the deep, slow pulse of the world. Above them the sky stretched vast and indifferent and full of stars. Below the earth turned, carrying wood and stone and flesh and story together into another day. And somewhere between fear and comfort, between danger and safety, between childhood and whatever comes after, a woman in a red cloak slept, no longer lost, no longer trying to be someone else's idea of saved. She slept, and the forest kept watch,